Chapter. The rainy night ejection, the windshield wipers swept across the glass, pushing the cold November rain from left to right, then right to left in a futile rhythm. The CAR heater was running at full blast, but George A. Reris still felt a chill creeping into his bones that had nothing to do with his 65 EARs or the two titanium joints in his knees. He had lived with this PA Article AR coldness for most of his adult life, and he knew its name well. It was called abandonment. "What the hell do you mean by that?" Vivian George's voice was flat. It was not a question so much as a confirmation of something he already knew. He sat in the passenger seat, the seat belt still pressing against his chest. In the rear-view mirror, he caught a glimpse of his own face, skin spotted with age, Marquez deep-set eyes, and that faded baseball cap he had worn for NIE Raleigh 30 ARs, its brim frayed and soft. Vivian HRS, his wife, was a well-maintained blonde woman who looked a good 10 years younger than her actual age. Her manicured fingers, tipped with crimson nail polish, were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She did not even glance at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the rain-blurred highway ahead. "George, I have had enough," she said, her voice carrying a cold, calculated calm. "You sit at home every single day, drinking beer, watching those ancient DUAR documentaries, and staring at the grass in the yard. What happened to our savings? You poured them down the drain like they were nothing. I am tired of hesitating over buying a decent evening gown. I am tired of being laughed at in the country club because I am a ride to a plumber." George frowned. He had been a plumber when he was young, and a very good one at that. But what he had done later in life was far more complicated than fixing pipes. "Vivian," he said again, "we have talked about this. My investments need a little more time to mature. They are not down the drain." "Investments?" Vivian let out a sharp, brittle laugh. "You call lending money to that friend of yours from Vietnam who flips used CARs an investment? George, you are a senile old fool! He swindled you. We are finished. This family is finished." "Do you think Cheryl and her husband moved to the West Coast for any other reason? They could not stand to look at your useless face anymore." "Neither can I." The CAR swerved sharply toward the shoulder of the road, its tires squealing against the wet pavement. Before George could react, Vivian had unbuckled his seatbelt and shoved open his door. The cold wind and rain rushed in like a blade, cutting across his face. "Get out," Vivian said, her lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. "Take your so-called investments and go to hell. I am done with your incompetence, your stubbornness, and that stench of motor oil that never washes out of your clothes." "Vivian, it is raining outside. This place is in the middle of nowhere." George looked past her, out the open door. The roadside was a stretch of barren cornfield, the leftover stalks dark and skeletal in the rain. There was not a single light visible in any direction. "I do not see a ra." Vivian's voice rose, sharp and shrill inside the cramped cabin. "Do whatever you want. Walk, freeze to death. I do not give a damn. And do not even think about coming back. The house is in Cheryl's name. You are entitled to nothing." George studied the woman he had shared a bed with for 40 years. In that moment, she seemed like a complete stranger. He felt no anger, barely even sadness. What he felt was a bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that comes when a long-awaited ending finally arrives. He bent down, picked up the worn canvas bag at his feet. The only thing he had taken with him. Inside were a few changes of clothes, an old book, and his outdated flip phone. He stepped out of the CAR, his feet landing on the cold, slick gravel of the shoulder. Behind him, the door slammed shut with a heavy thud. Then came the sound of tires spinning on wet asphalt, the roar of the engine as it revved, and finally, the red taillights shrinking into the rainy darkness until they vanished like dying embers. The rain soaked him through in seconds. George stood on the roadside, wiping the water from his face. Some of the wetness was rain, but some of it was something hotter, something that stung his eyes. He clutched the canvas bag tightly against his chest and started walking along the highway, one step after another. He had helped build this stretch of road when he was young. He knew there was a gas station about 5 miles ahead, and another 10 miles beyond that, a place called the Veterans Rest Stop. The owner there knew him. It took him nearly 2 hours to reach the gas station. The night clerk was a young Mexican-American kid who took one look at George's bedraggled state and rushed to get him a cup of hot coffee. George shivered as he drank it, then used the payphone by the restroom to dial a number he had not called in years. It was a number buried deep in his memory. The phone rang twice before a steady male voice answered. "Who is this?" "It's me," George said, his voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "Paladin needs a ride. I'm at the gas station on Ohio Route 73. There was a pause on the other end, a beat of silence, and then the voice shifted, gaining a sharp edge of recognition and alarm. "Are you certain?" "Foxhole," George replied, squinting through the rain-streaked window at the endless downpour. "Confirm the code." "Nightingale is singing." "Understood." The voice on the other end became crisp, professional. "A vehicle will be there within 45 minutes." "Sir." "All right." George read at the condensation forming on the phone receiver. He grunted a soft affirmative, then hung up. He did not tell them whether he was all right. He just needed a place to sit down, and a quiet moment to figure out how to handle the defense technology patent licensing deal worth $360 million that his so-called used car dealer friend had just finalized on his behalf. His wife had thrown him out of the car thinking he was the most useless waste of space on the planet. George leaned back against the plastic chair in the gas station, his wet hat dripping onto the floor. He found it almost funny. He had been chased through the jungles of Colombia, trapped for a week in a bunker in Bosnia, and none of it had felt quite as cold as this. But cold was good. Cold helped freeze out the useless sentiment. The ride arrived sooner than expected. A black Chevrolet Suburban pulled silently into the gas station lot, ring government plates. A young man in a black suit, with a close-cropped millet-rye haircut, stepped out, walked briskly inside, and spotted George. He snapped to attention and saluted, then caught himself, dropping his hand as he approached. "Sir, I'm Lieutenant Jackson. Headquarters sent me. Do you need medical assistance?" "No," George said, hefting his wet canvas bag. "Take me somewhere I can make a call and get online. I need to check some documents, some bank accounts too. It's been a while." Jackson took the bag from him without a word and held open the rear door of the Suburban. The inside was warm and dry, the leather seats smelling clean and expensive. George climbed in, leaned back against the headrest, and let out a long, slow breath. The vehicle pulled smoothly into the rainy night. Jackson glanced at George in the rear view mirror. In certain classified files at the Pentagon, the name Paladin belonged to a legend. George H.A. had a record of service that made senior officers go quiet with respect. When he retired, he turned down every medal and every post, choosing instead to live on a modest pension as an ordinary man. Everyone assumed his savings had been squandered, but Jackson knew the truth. Every cent George had ever earned had gone into a project that would give the United States a 10-year lead in next-generation communications technology, and that project had just paid off. The Suburban was quiet. George looked out at the blurred streetlights and said, "Lieutenant, are you my ride?" "Yes, sir." 3 hours now. Are you good to your wife?" Jackson hesitated, then answered ruefully, "I try to be, sir." George nodded and said nothing more. He had been good to his wife, too. He had trusted her with everything, even the arts of his life he could not talk about. He had believed she understood why he came home late sometimes, why he could not always explain where he had been. He had been wrong. He had handed her his ERT, and she had looked at it like it was an old, broken thing not worth a nickel, and tossed it onto a rain-soaked highway. The CAR left the main road and entered an area that looked like an ordinary industrial park. But the layers of security at the gate told George this was nothing ordinary. Fingerprints, iris scans, voice recognition, door after door. Jackson led him into a suite that was armed, dry and fully equipped. Sir, this will be your Tempor Raikou routers. All communications res secure and ready for use. Your bank accounts have been reactivated, and a liaison is standing by. Jackson paused, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. The financial records and social media activity for your wife and daughter over the last year have been compiled and loaded onto the tablet on the desk. George took off his wet jacket and dropped it on the floor. He walked to the desk, picked up the tablet, and began scrolling. The screen showed Vivian's recent spending at luxury boutiques, her country club dues, and Cheryl's art gallery on the West Coast. A business that had been kept afloat entirely with money George had provided. And then he saw it, a file they had both signed, a plan to commit him to a cheap state, run CA facility once they had drained every last dollar from his accounts. The house they lived in was already listed for sale. George put the tablet down. He did not slam it or throw it. He walked to the window, looked out at the steady winter rain, and allowed a thin, bitter smile to cross his lips. Vivian, you told me to do whatever I want, so that is exactly what I am going to do. Chapter R. Undercurrents stirring. George B.A. Raleigh slept that first night in the secure suit. He was not thinking about Vivian or Cheryl. His mind kept returning to the financial reports on the tablet. He checked a private account he had not touched in years and found several $1,000,000 sitting there, accumulated from consulting work he had done long ago. It was enough money for a comfortable life, but it was nothing compared to what was about to come. The patent deal alone would bring in tens of millions annually for the next decade. What kept him awake was the agreement itself. Decades earlier, he had been part of a classified military communications project codenamed Nightingale. After leaving active duty, he continued working as a civilian advisor, adapting military-grade encryption for civilian rockets. The core patents had been placed in a trust, managed by a trusted intermediary, an old Baywar. But that man had died suddenly, and the transfer had gotten tangled up in red tape. Only recently had the legal issues been resolved. Now the licensing deal was final. A global tech giant would pay him handsomely for the rights to his work, and the first payment had already been deposited. Very few people in the world knew that the retired old man in the worn outhouse with the leaky roof was the sole owner of some of the most valuable communications patents on the planet. George intended to keep it that way for now. At dawn, Lieutenant Jackson knocked on his door. "Sir, we need to fly to Washington today. The final confirmation documents for the patent transfer require your personal signature. Also, some senior defense officials have requested a meeting. Word has spread that you are re-emerging." George was shaving with an old electric razor. He studied his reflection. The bags under his eyes looked deeper than they had yesterday, but his gaze was clearer. He wiped his face with a towel. "Tell them I will be there this afternoon. Have a plane ready at Columbus Airport." "Yes, sir," Jackson nodded. "One more thing, sir. Do you want our legal team to begin the asset division process between you and your wife? Under Ohio state law, trust income acquired before and during marriage can be protected." "No." George cut him off. "I will handle that myself. I need you to find me a lawyer, not some slick corporate type from a big firm. Find me someone who has run a small practice in a small town for decades, someone who knows divorce and property law inside and out." Jackson noted it down. "And sir, there is something else. Your wife and daughter have been active on social media. You may want to see it." George finished buttoning his shirt and picked up the tablet. Vivian's Facebook page showed a new photo. She was sitting by a fireplace in the country club, a glass of red wine in her hand, surrounded by women in designer clothes. The caption read, "Dropping the dead weight. Every woman deserves to put herself first." The comments were filled with praise. Someone asked about George, and Vivian replied with a shrugging emoji. "He found a lifestyle more suited to him," she wrote. "We'll wish him well." George scrolled down to Cheryl's Instagram. She had posted a video from her gallery, a Woolery house like space decorated with neon lights. She and her husband, a man with a carefully trimmed beard, were clinking glasses. "To new beginnings," she said to the camera. "Sometimes you have to cut the ropes holding you down in order to fly higher." When someone commented asking about her father, she deleted the comment without replying. George put the tablet aside. His face betrayed no emotion. He walked to the closet, took out a Shekshey Orkol gray wool coat Jackson had provided, and put it on. It fit perfectly, and the fabric was soft and heavy, a far cry from the frayed jacket he had been wearing the day before. The flight to Washington was smooth. George sat in the small Gulfstream and stared at the clouds below. He did not hate Vivian or Cheryl. He was simply trying to understand when things had changed. When had the woman who held his hand in the delivery room and said he would be a wonderful father turned into someone who saw him as a burden? When had the little girl who sat on his shoulders during fireworks displays and shouted, "Daddy is the best," decided he was a rope she needed to cut? Maybe it started soon after he retired. He had wanted to leave the old life behind completely. He took a job as a plumber, came home smelling of grease and pipe sealant, and never talked about his past. He thought ordinariness was a kind of peace. He thought silence was a form of protection. But Vivian wanted to be Mrs. H.A.R.S. at the country club, not the plumber's wife. Cheryl wanted to brag about her father's job at private school, not hear people whisper about the repairman. They never knew they could have been a general's family. They could have touched the highest circles of power in the country. Instead, they chose to see him as worthless, and they threw him away. The Gulfstream touched down at Dulles Airport. A black sedan met him on the tarmac and ride him to a gray, unmarked building. George met with several men in civilian clothes who had once worn uniforms. They treated him with a deference that bordered on reverence, speaking to him like students addressing a retired master. They discussed the future of the Nightingale technology, matters of national security, and of course, the money. Everything proceeded smoothly. During a break in the meetings, George borrowed an office computer and logged into an encrypted email account he had not used in a long time. He sent a message to a contact in New York, a man who specialized in financial investigations. The message was short. "Check the art gallery in Santa Monica run by my daughter and her husband. I want to know if there is anything dirty in their books. Also, my wife has listed a house with a local realtor in Ohio. Find out if she is planning to sell and run." The reply came back in less than 20 minutes. A single word. "Received." Attached was a report so detailed it made George's jaw tighten. Cheryl's husband, the gallery owner with the cultured manners, had been using the business to launder money for years. He had also been covering his own failed stock market bets with the family funds George had provided. As for Vivian, she had indeed contacted a realtor and was preparing to sell the house at a premium. The proceeds, according to the draft agreement she had signed with Cheryl, would be split evenly, with her half going to a condo in Florida. George closed the report. He did not immediately plan a counterattack. He only needed to know how far they were willing to go. Now he knew. That evening, George did not return to the secure suite. Instead, he asked Jackson to drive him to the Veterans Rest Stop. It was a modest dive bar, walls covered with faded flags and old photographs, the air thick with the smells of cheap beer and worn wood. The owner was a one-eyed black man named Red, who spotted George the moment he walked in and broke into a wide, gold-toothed grin. "Holy hell," Red said, wiping down the counter. "I figured you were dead in a ditch somewhere." "Almost," George said, taking a seat at the bar. "Bourbon." Red poured him a glass, then sat across from him. That AR pie of yours kicked you out. News travels fast in this town. Small place." Red shrugged. "She was at the Waterfowl Tavern last night, drinkin' and tellin' everyone you were a worthless bum. She said she left you on the highway with nothin'. Half the county thinks you're a homeless vagrant now." George sipped his bourbon. The heat of the liquor slid down his throat and settled in his chest. "Let them talk." Red leaned in closer, his voice dropping. "George, I know you ain't ordinary. I was in that jungle with you. You saved my ass more than once. If you need a place to crash, you know my door is open." George looked at his old friend, that one good eye shining with genuine concern. He felt a nubbly that had been absent for days. He put a hand on Red's shoulder. "I appreciate that, old buddy, but I am not here to sleep. I want to borrow this place for a few days. Have some people to meet." "What kind of people?" "People who owe me favors," George said, staring into the amber liquid. "And a few who will soon be begging me for them." Red gave him a curious look but did not pry. "Do what you want. The back room is yours." George took his glass to a quiet corner table and sat down. He pulled out his old flip phone and dialed a number. It rang a few times before a lazy voice answered. "Yeah. Who is this at this hour?" "Frank," George said. "It's George H.A. Riss." The voice snapped to full attention. "George, holy crap, you ray alive. I hear Arj your wife." "All of that is true," George cut him off. "Bet I am calling because I want to know if you are still working at the Ohio Attorney General's office." "Sure am. Beating the clock till retirement." "I have a case I want to discuss with you," George said calmly. "It involves family property fraud and malicious abandonment. I might need you to start gathering evidence ahead of time." There was a pause on the other end. Then Frank's voice came through, laced with a hint of excitement. "George, are you finally going to make a move?" George looked out the window at the dark. A day ago, he had been standing in that same kind of rain, watching the taillights of his wife's car disappear. He let out a quiet breath. "Yeah, Frank, I am making a move." Chapter. The Boayard takes shape. The Veterans Rest Stop began to change the very next afternoon. First came two men in leather jackets and dark sunglasses, driving an unmoored black Dodge. They parked in the back lot, exchanged a few words with Red, and spent the next hour setting up a small array of electronic equipment in the back room. Then came a man in a wrinkled suit, carrying a scuffed briefcase, walking with a slight limp. Frank Morrison had arrived, a veteran of the Ohio Attorney General's office who specialized in complex white-collar cases and family disputes. Frank shook George's hand and looked around the dim bar. He let out a low whistle. "George, your new headquarters has a certain..." "It works," George said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Did you look over the material I sent?" "I did." Frank sat down and grew serious. "Your wife's real estate deal and your daughter's gallery accounts have more holes than a sieve. Even if a property is in one spouse's name, the other spouse must sign off on the sale. That power of attorney your wife submitted is a forgery. Plain and simple. As for the gallery, some of the incoming funds trace back to a West Coast entertainment company that is already under federal investigation." George nodded calmly. "I need you to do two things. First, freeze the property transfer. Do not make a scene. Just let the state land office hold it up on a technicality. Let her believe it is just a paperwork delay. Second, collect all the evidence on that forged signature, but do not act on it yet." "Easy enough," Frank agreed. He leaned forward, curiosity in his eyes. "So when are you planning to drop the hammer?" "I have spoken with some people at the Pentagon. They tell me you have the resources to bury these people in both state and federal court." George leaned back in his chair and looked at a faded map of Vietnam on the wall. "Not yet. They already threw me out of the CAR in their heads. Now I want them to feel what it is like to be thrown off a cliff in real life. I want them to watch, piece by piece, everything they thought they had crumble in their hands." While George was laying his plans in the dusty back room of the BAR, Vivian H. A. Raris was enjoying a week of blissful freedom. She had convinced herself that George was gone for good, likely shivering in some shelter or, at best, crashing on a cot at a rundown veterans hall. She had blocked his number and deleted his contact. The house felt a larger, now emptier, but she liked it that way. She could move freely, decorate as she pleased, and soon she would sell the place and move south. But the sale was not going as smoothly as she hoped. Her realtor, a slick-haired man named Brooks, called her that afternoon with hesitation in his voice. "The state land office has flagged the title verification. They need a clearer spousal waiver. The one you submitted out the ARs to be an outdated format." Outdated? Vivian's voice shot up. "That document was drawn up by a licensed attorney! How can it be outdated? I am not sure." "Ma'am, the state office says they need a fresh, notarized copy, and they prefer an original signature from your husband himself." Vivian gripped the phone so her knuckles ached. George was gone. She had no idea where he was sleeping, let alone how to get his signature. She took a breath, forcing calm into her tone. "Mr. Brooks, my husband is currently out of state. He is receiving medical treatment in California. Could we proceed with a notarized affidavit from me instead? I am sorry, Mrs., but these state regulations, I cannot bypass them. Perhaps you could have your husband sign the form and mail it back. We can move the rest of the paperwork for ARD in the meantime." Vivian hung up and threw her phone onto the sofa. She looked around the living room, the same room she had read with George for over 2 decades. The furniture was worn, the wallpaper outdated, but the property itself sat on a prime lot, $40,000, maybe $50,000, enough to give her the fresh art she craved. She called Cheryl. The phone rang several times before her daughter picked up. "What is it?" "I am in the middle of something." "It is about the house," Vivian said, summarizing the problem. "The land office is stalling. They want your father's signature. Do you have any idea where he is?" "I blocked his number." Cheryl sighed on the other end, the sound full of annoyance. "Mom, I do not keep track of Dad's whereabouts. That old flip phone of his is probably dead by now, and his friends are all strange old men I have never met. So what am I supposed to do? I have already put a deposit on that condo in Florida." "Relax, Mom." Cheryl's voice dropped into that relaxed tone she had used since childhood, a tone that suggested the world existed to accommodate her whims. "Just have someone copy his signature. It is not a big deal. Dad's signature is simple, just a George H. with a little flourish. I used to sign his permission slips for school all the time." Vivian's heart skipped. Forging a signature was a serious step, but the thought lasted only a moment. George was broke, powerless, and alone. He could not afford a lawyer, much less the resources to challenge her. She made up her mind. "Send me a sample of his signature. I will find someone to recreate it." "Fine. I will text it to you later." After hanging up, Vivian poured herself a glass of wine. She stood by the window, looking out at the messy yard. George used to keep it tidy, mowing the grass, trimming the hedges, planting flowers in the spring. Now the leaves were piling up and nobody saw it. She took a sip of wine and pushed the thought away. That was his problem, not hers. A few hundred miles to the west, Cheryl H. Raris White sat in a coffee shop near the Ohio State University campus, flipping through an ART magazine she was not really reading. Her mother's call had left her irritated. She hated being dragged into family drama. All of this mess was her father's fault. If he had been a normal, successful father, someone with connections and money, she would not have to scrape by, patching together funds to keep her gallery afloat. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her husband, Mayor K. Big investor coming tonight, dress RP. Also, the bank called about that $30,000 AR deposit into the gallery account. I said it was art pre-sales. Remember that if anyone asks. She typed back, okay, and dropped the phone face down on the table. Outside, students walked past in groups, couples pushed strollers, and ordinary people lived ordinary lives. For a fleeting moment, Cheryl remembered being a little girl, standing right outside this very coffee shop with her father. He had counted out crumpled AR bills from his pocket to buy her a hot chocolate with extra whipped cream, the biggest size they had. Back then, she thought her father was the strongest man in the world because he could fix anything with a wrench. Now she knew better. The world did not run on wrenches. It ran on money, status, and the way people looked at you. And George H.A. Riss could give her none of those things. She gathered her purse and left the coffee shop, the old memory dissolving in the afternoon light. Across the street, a gray Ford sedan sat idling inside. Lieutenant Jackson watched the coffee shop entrance through a pair of binoculars. His technician checked the monitoring equipment and reported in a low voice, "Sir, we intercepted a call between the TA Roget and her mother. They discussed forging a signature to complete a real estate transaction. The call has been recorded and stored." Jackson nodded. "Good. Continue surveillance. And forward the latest financial data on the gallery to Mr. Morrison. The commander wants them to feel comfortable and confident right up until the moment the trap closes." He rotted the engine and pulled the sedan into the flow of traffic. Outside, the first flakes of winter snow began to drift down from a gray sky. The cold season was finally arriving, and with it, the winter of George H. Riss's patience. Later that evening, George sat alone in the back room of the Veterans Rest Stop. The two technicians had finished their setup and rotted. Frank had left to process the evidence. George had a thick folder of documents in front of him, photographs, bank statements, legal filings, all arranged in neat stacks. He reviewed each one carefully, memorizing details, checking timelines. Red knocked and came in with a plate of cold sandwiches and a fresh glass of bourbon. "You been at this all afternoon," Red said, putting the plate down. "You look like a man planning a doer." George took the glass and drank. "It's not a guar, Red. It's a lesson." "A lesson in what?" George looked up at his old friend, and for the first time in days, a real smile crossed his weathered face. "A lesson in what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. Vivian thinks I am a broken down old plumber with nothing to his name. Cheryl thinks I am an embarrassment. They believe they can take everything and leave me with nothing. They are about to find out how wrong they are." A Red sat down across from him, unwrapping a sandwich. "You ever plan to tell them who you really are? What you really did?" George shook his head slowly. "That rot of my life is over. I do not need medals or titles. I just need them to understand, in their own gut, that they traded something real for something fake, and that the fake is about to crumble." He picked up a photograph from the folder, a recent picture of Vivian smiling in her country club dress. He studied it for a moment, then placed it face down on the table. Some battle he had leeward over the Yars were won before the first shot was fired. This was one of them. All he had to do now was wait for the enemy to walk into the open. Chapters. The noose tightens the following week unfolded like a slow, steady pull on a fishing line. Vivian and Cheryl went about their days, feeling the occasional tug of something wrong, but neither of them could see the hook. Vivian's house sale seemed to be moving forward again. The forged signature had been submitted, the paperwork had been processed, and Brooks the realtor assured her that they were on track for a closing date. She began ordering new furniture for her Florida condo over the phone, picking out colors for curtains, sending deposit checks for a moving company. But small annoyances kept cropping up. Her country club membership renewal was declined, and the bank told her there was a temporary freeze on one of her accounts due to an irregular withdrawal pattern. She spent hours on the phone screaming at customer service representatives, eventually resolving the issue, but the unease lingered. Then her CAR payment bounced. She had transferred the money, the bank confirmed it, but the lender's system showed it as pending for days. She had to drive to the bank in person, wait in line, and fill out forms to clear it up. Each of these problems was minor on its own, but they came in a steady drip, like a leaky faucet she could not find. Cheryl's problems were worse. A buyer finally showed interest in the large abstract painting that had been gathering dust in her gallery for nearly a year. The piece was priced at $200,000, and Cheryl and Mark scrambled to clean it, reframe it, and present it as a showpiece. The buyer arrived, a sharp-eyed Asian woman with a consultant in tow. She studied the painting in silence for 5 minutes, then asked a simple question. Can you provide a complete provenance chain for this work? I understand there have been some questions about the customs documentation for this series. Mark's smile froze. The painting had been purchased cheaply from a struggling European gallery, but he had inflated its value and shuffled the paperwork to hide the real transaction. He stammered something about needing to locate the files. The buyer smiled, left her card, and said, "Call me when you find them." She never called back. 2 days later, Cheryl received a call from a woman claiming to be a journalist from a New York ART magazine. The caller wanted to discuss financial compliance issues in the contemporary art market. Cheryl hung up immediately, her hands trembling. She called Mark in a panic. "Someone is looking into us. I can feel it." Mark tried to reassure her. "It is probably nothing, maybe just routine inquiries. The art world is full of busybodies." But his voice lacked conviction. Cheryl began searching online for her father's name, looking for any sign that he might be behind these problems. She found nothing. George Herreras had no online presence, no social media accounts, no news articles. It was as if he had disappeared from the Roth. She called Vivian. "Mom, are you sure Dad does not have any money hidden somewhere, or any connections? I keep thinking about that night you left him on the road. What if he had some kind of backup plan?" Vivian laughed, a brittle, dismissive sound. "Cheryl, your father spent 30 years fixing toilets and unclogging drains. The only backup plan he ever had was a spare wrench in his truck. Stop worrying about him. He is probably sitting in some VA hospital waiting room, eating free crackers and watching daytime television." Cheryl wanted to believe her mother, but deep down, she remembered something about her father that did not fit the picture Vivian painted. She remembered the way other adults, especially older men in suits, had sometimes treated him with a strange respect. She remembered a moment when she was about 12 years old, when a man in a dark car came to their house late at night, and her father went outside to talk to him. When he came back in, his face was calm, but his hands were shaking. She had asked who that was, and he had said, "Just an old friend, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." She had believed him then. Now she was not so sure. At the Veterans Rest Stop, George's quiet operation was running like clockwork. Frank Morrison visited daily with updates. The State Land Office had flagged the forged signature, but held off on taking action. The federal investigation into the gallery's finances was proceeding, guided by anonymous tips that pointed directly at Mark's sloppy accounting. Lieutenant Jackson provided surveillance summaries and kept George informed about the emotional states of his targets. George spent most of his time in the back room, reading old books and sipping coffee. He did not gloat, he did not scheme, he simply waited. The art of patience had been drilled into him decades ago. in places where a wrong move meant death. This situation was different, but the principle was the same. Let the enemy make mistakes. Let them dig their own hole. Then simply show up with a shovel and fill it in. Red came in one evening and found George staring at a photograph of Cheryl taken years ago at her high school graduation. She was wearing a cap and gown, smiling broad. One arm linked through George's arm. Red set down a bottle of beer and spoke softly. "Okay, old man." George put the photograph down. "I am fine. Just remembering." "Remembering what?" George took a sip of beer. "I remember riding her on my shoulders through a PA raid when she was 5 years old. She had a little flag in her hand, and she waved it so hard she nearly fell off. I caught her by the ankle. She laughed like it was the best game in the world. She used to think I could do anything. Catch her when she fell, fix her broken toys, chase away the monsters under her bed." Red nodded slowly. "Kids grow up. Sometimes they forget." "I know." George's voice was flat. "I gave them everything I had. Not money, but time. I was there for every birthday, every school play, every scraped knee. I thought that was what mattered. I thought love was the currency that would last. But they wanted a different kind of currency. They wanted the kind you can spend at the country club and the art gallery. And when they found out I did not have enough of that, they decided I was worthless." He finished the beer and set the bottle down. "So now I am going to show them that I had more of that currency all along than they ever imagined. But it will be too late for them to spend it. That is the lesson, Red. The worst punishment is not losing something you have. It is realizing you threw something away that you could have had forever." Red was quiet for a long time. Then he patted George on the shoulder. "You are a better man than most, George. Better than they deserve." George did not answer. He simply looked out the window at the snow-covered parking lot, a place far removed from the comfortable homes and expensive cars of his former family. The following Friday, Vivian walked into the county land office with a confident stride. Brooks the realtor met her in the lobby, and together they went into the closing room. The buyers were a young couple from Columbus, eager and nervous. Vivian smiled at them, signed her name on a dozen forms, and felt a surge of relief when the final page was done. The money would be in her account by Monday. Florida was just days away. But as she reached for her purse, the door opened, and Frank Morrison walked in. Behind him stood a woman in a state government ID badge. Frank looked at Vivian with an expression that was almost gentle. "I am afraid we need to pause this transaction." Vivian's smile vanished. "Why?" "Everything is signed." Frank picked up the forged waiver and held it up. "This document has been flagged as a possible forgery. The state has opened an investigation into the authenticity of your husband's signature. Until that investigation is complete, the sale is suspended. Additionally, I have been instructed to inform you that your husband, George Schrick, has filed a complaint regarding the unauthorized transfer of joint assets. You will be receiving formal papers shortly." Vivian's face went pale. She stared at Frank, then at the young couple, then at Brooks, whose professional smile had turned into a look of alarm. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "My husband is a nobody. He has no money, no lawyers, no influence. You cannot do this." Frank calmly placed a business card on the table. "You are welcome to contact my office if you have any questions. I would advise you to secure legal representation. Good day, Mrs. Aris." He walked out, leaving Vivian standing frozen in the closing room. The young couple exchanged uncomfortable glances and quietly gathered their things. Brooks excused himself with a mumbled apology. Vivian was left alone in the sterile office, her dream of Florida collapsing in a matter of minutes. She pulled out her phone and dialed Cheryl with shaking fingers. "Cheryl, something terrible has happened. They stopped the sale. They said your father has filed a complaint. He has a lawyer now." "How is that possible? Where did he get a lawyer?" There was a long silence on the other end. Then Cheryl spoke, and her voice was thin and CA red. "Mom, I have been trying to call you all morning. Something has gone wrong here too." Federal agents came to the gallery. They took all the files. They questioned Meme for hours. They said they are reinvestigating us for money laundering. "Mom, I think Dad might actually be behind this. I think he is not who we thought he was." Vivian sank into a plastic chair and stared red at the blank wall. For the first time since she had opened that car door on the rainy highway, a sliver of doubt crept into her mind. She thought about George's quiet eyes, his steady hands, his refusal to ever raise his voice in anger. She had always taken that for weakness. But maybe she had been wrong. Maybe she had mistaken a sleeping lion for a tired old house cat, and now the lion was waking up. Chapter 2. The reckoning and the aftermath. The snow had stopped falling by Saturday morning. A pale winter sun broke through the clouds, and its light reflected off the frozen ground with a rush, blinding. Vivian sat in her living room, still wearing the same clothes from the day before. She had not slept. She had spent the night making calls, leaving voicemails, and staring at her phone, waiting for anyone, to tell her that the night Marie was a mistake. The calls had not come. She had tried to reach George, dialing his old number, the one she had blocked, and then unblocked in a desperate attempt to connect. It went straight to a generic recorded message saying the number was no longer in service. She had called Cheryl multiple times, but her daughter's phone rang and rang, then went to voicemail. She had called Brooks, the realtor, who answered with a clipped, cold tone and told her he could no longer represent her due to a potential conflict of interest. Vivian walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Her hands were trembling. The house around her felt foreign, the furniture too large, the walls too close. She had lived here for over 20 years, and yet she felt like a stranger in her own home. She walked to the front window and looked out at the snow-covered yard. The leaves were still there, buried under the white, waiting for spring that would never come. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She lunged for it, expecting Cheryl or maybe a lawyer returning her call. But the name on the screen was unfamiliar. She answered anyway, her voice Ross. "Hello, Mrs. Herreras." The voice was male, professional, and calm. "This is Lieutenant Jackson. I am calling on behalf of your husband, George Herreras. He has asked me to deliver a message." Vivian felt her stomach drop. "Where is he? Is he all right? Tell him I need to speak to him immediately." "Mr. Herreras is fine. He is currently unavailable for personal calls. The message is simple. He would like you to gather your personal belongings and vacate this property by the end of the day. The house will be secured, and you will receive formal eviction papers through the proper channels on Monday." Vivian almost laughed, a strangled, hysterical sound. "Evict me from my own house? That is absurd. The house is in Cheryl's name. He has no right to do anything." "I would advise you to check the deed," Jackson said evenly. "The property was transferred to your daughter several years ago as part of a trust arrangement. However, the trust was established with funds that originated from your husband's personal accounts. Under the terms of the trust, he retains beneficiary rights. With the assistance of his legal counsel, those rights are now being exercised. The house will be sold, and the proceeds will be redirected to a fund that you and your daughter are not authorized to access." Vivian dropped the phone. It clattered onto the kitchen counter, and she heard Jackson's voice still speaking, tinny and distant, but she could not bring herself to pick it up again. She stood there frozen, trying to process what she had just heard. The house was not hers. It had never truly been hers. George had given it to Cheryl, but he had kept a thread attached, a thread he was now pulling. She walked upstairs to the bedroom she had shared with George and looked at the closet. Her clothes, her shoes, her jewelry boxes, everything she had accumulated over the years, suddenly looked like borrowed things. She opened a drawer and found an old photograph of George, taken decades ago before his hair went gray, before his knees gave out. He was standing beside a Millet A ride jeep in a tropical country, wearing a faded uniform and a tired smile. She had never asked him where that picture was taken. She had never asked him about the ski ARs on his ARMs, or the nightmare res that sometimes woke him in the middle of the night. She had simply assumed they were relics of a boring, unimportant past. Now she was not sure what they were in California. Cheryl was facing her own reckoning. The federal agents had left, but the damage was done. Her gallery was closed, its doors locked, its windows covered with brown paper. Mark had been taken downtown for more questioning and had not returned. She sat alone in their empty apartment, surrounded by packing boxes they had prepared for an upcoming move. A move that was no longer happening. She had made dozens of calls, trying to reach anyone who could help, but every lawyer she contacted either refused to take the case or quoted fees far beyond what she could afford. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her credit cards had been declined. She had no money, no prospects, and no one to turn to, except maybe her father. The thought was so foreign, so painful, that she pushed it away again and again, but it kept returning like a pulse. She remembered the last time she had seen him, on a Sunday afternoon a few months ago. He had come to visit her gallery, and she had been embarrassed by his worn-out jacket, his scuffed boots, his clumsy attempt to appreciate the abstract art on the walls. She had rushed him through the tour, made excuses to cut the visit short, and felt relieved when he finally left. She had not spoken to him since. Now she picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts, watching for any way to reach him. She had deleted his number months ago. She called her mother again, desperate. "Mom, I need Dad's number. I need to apologize to him. I need him to call off whatever he is doing. Please, do you have any way to reach him?" Vivian's voice was hollow on the other end. "I do not have his number, Cheryl. He has a new phone, a new address. Everything is new. He has vanished. We have vanished from his life, and now he has vanished from ours." Cheryl hung up and sat on the floor of her apartment, hugging her knees. The floor was cold, the heating was off, and she could see her own breath. She had spent so much energy trying to build a life that looked impressive from the outside, a gallery with white walls and expensive lighting, a husband with a charming smile, a social media presence full of curated photos. But all of it was paper thin, and the first real wind had blown it away. George, meanwhile, was sitting in the quiet warmth of the Veterans Rest Stop, sipping a cup of coffee and reading a worn copy of an old military history book. Red was behind the counter, wiping glasses and watching the door. The back room had been cleared out. The technicians were gone. Frank had left the day before, shaking George's hand and promising to handle the final paperwork. It was noon, the sun was bright outside, and the snow was beginning to melt. George felt a deep calm settling over him, a stillness that came not from victory, but from closure. He had spent his life doing hard things, making difficult choices, and this week had been one of the hardest. But it was over now. Red walked over and sat down across from him. "You sure you do not want to see them? Just once? Let them look you in the eye and know what they lost." George shook his head. "No, Red, that would be for me, not for them, and I do not need it. I have already gotten what I needed." "And what is that?" George looked out the window at the melting snow. "Peace. I spent 40 years trying to be a good husband and a good father. I gave them everything I could, and they chose to see it as nothing. That hurt. It hurt more than any bullet or blade I ever took. But I cannot make them love me, and I cannot make them value what I gave them. All I can do is stop letting them take what I have left." He finished his coffee and set the cup down. "Now I am done. They will not be able to sell that house, or use that money, or keep that gallery. They will have to stay over with nothing. and maybe someday they will understand why. But that is their journey. Mine is here, with friends who actually see a whether I live or die. Red laughed softly and clapped him on the shoulder. You old bastard. You have a way of making a point that sticks. A few miles away, Vivian was packing a small suitcase. She had no choice. A sheriff's deputy had arrived that morning with official papers, and she had been given until 5 o'clock to leave. She filled the suitcase with her most expensive clothes, a few pieces of jewelry, and her passport. Everything else, all the furniture, the china, the silver, the paintings on the walls, would be inventoried and sold. She walked out the front door and closed it behind her, not knowing where she would go. She climbed into her car, the same car she had driven on that rainy night, and started the engine. The gas tank was nearly empty. Her credit cards were frozen. She had about $60 in cash in her wallet. She thought about checking into a motel, but she was not sure she could afford even a single night. She sat in the driveway. Stella rang at the house she had thought was hers, and for the first time in many years, she began to cry. In California, Cheryl finally got out of the apartment. She walked to a small cafe near her old gallery and ordered a cup of coffee she could not afford. She sat at a table by the window, watching people pass by. A man with a small child entered the cafe, and the little girl tugged on his sleeve, asking for a key. The man smiled and bought her one, handing it to her with a gentle pat on the head. Cheryl watched the scene and felt a hollow ache in her chest. She thought about her father, about the way he used to hold her hand when she was small, the way he would kneel down to tie her shoelaces, the way he would always say, "I love you, sweetheart," before she went to sleep. She had stopped hearing that voice years ago, drowned out by louder, more demanding voices in her head. But now, in the silence, the voice came back. She pulled out her phone and typed a long message to a number she did not even know if he still used. "Dad, I am so sorry. I was wrong about everything. I do not know where you are, but I hope you are safe. I hope you can forgive me someday. I always did. I just forgot." She hit send and waited. The message went through, but there was no reply. She put the phone down and read out the window, wondering if he would ever read it, wondering if he even still remembered the little girl who used to wave flags from his shoulders. George received the message on his new phone an hour later. He read it once, then read it again. His face remained still, but his eyes softened just a fraction. He put the phone down and looked out the window. The snow was almost gone now, replaced by puddles that reflected the pale winter sky. Red walked over and saw the phone on the table. "Anything important?" George shook his head. "No, just an echo of what?" "Of a life I used to live," George said. "A life I have let go of now." He picked up the phone and deleted the message without replying. Then he stood up, stretched his old bones, and walked to the door. The sun was warm on his face, and the air smelled clean and fresh. He looked down the empty road, the same road where he had been left to walk alone in the rain. But he was not alone anymore. He had friends, he had peace, and he had a future. And that was more than enough. 3 weeks later, George H. Araris stood in a spacious office in Washington, D.C., surrounded by lawyers and executives from the technology company that had purchased his patents. The contract signing was a formal affair, but George signed his name with the same steady hand he had used to sign his enlistment papers decades ago. When the ceremony was over, a young assistant approached him and asked, "Rez, do you have any plans for your newfound wealth? Any family members you would like to provide for?" George thought about the question. He thought about Vivian, likely living in a rented room somewhere, trying to piece together a life from nothing. He thought about Cheryl, whose gallery had been seized, whose husband was facing federal charges. He could help them if he wanted. He had the money. He had the power. But he thought about the rain, the cold, the moment when he had stepped out of that car and felt the world turn its back on him. And he thought about the people who had welcomed him in, who had given him a place to sit and a drink to wubby army his bones, who had looked at him and seen a friend. "No," he said simply. "I have everything I need." He walked out of the office and into the winter sunlight, a free man at last. 3 months later, word spread through the small Ohio town that George H.A. Riss had become a benefactor of the local Veterans Association. He had donated a substantial sum to build a new community center with a library, a medical clinic, and a meeting hall. The center was named the H.A. Riss House, but George refused to attend the opening ceremony. He stayed in the background, just an old man in a baseball cap, drinking coffee at the Veterans Rest Stop. People who passed by the center would sometimes see him sitting by the window, watching the activities with a quiet smile. He never talked about his past, never bragged about his achievements. He was just George, the plumber who had somehow made good, the old soldier who had found his way home. And if anyone ever asked him about his wife or his daughter, he would simply shake his head and say, "They made their choices, I made mine, and I have no regrets." Which was not quite true. He had one regret. He regretted that he had ever let them make him believe he was worthless. But that regret was fading now, like the last patch of snow melting in the sun. He picked up his coffee, took a sip, and watched the children playing in the snow outside the new center. Their laughter ride through the cold air, bright and clear, and George H.A. Riss, the man who had been left for dead on a rainy highway, smiled because he had survived, and more than that, he had thrived. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. The end. If you enjoyed this story and want to follow George H.A. Riss on his next adventure, please subscribe to my channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new chapter. And if you have a story of your own about starting over, about finding strength you did not know you had, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. Stay strong, stay steady, and never forget, the road may be long, but it always leads somewhere. See you next time.